Hey everyone, welcome to A Mess Nonetheless. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Melissa. We are sisters. Welcome back to our part 2.
Yes.
Two-parter.
Of our two-parter. I wish I had already named this one.
Yeah.
What should we call it?
I don't know. Choose a cookie.
It's second part of Choose the Cookie Talk. If you have not listened to the one from our last episode, definitely go back. I think it doesn't make any sense to start here. I think you could start here, but the foundation has been laid.
Yeah. And we don't really know what's going to come out of our mouth, so it may or may not make sense to start here.
That is true. So we are talking about parenting and relationships and being consistent people in our relationships and apologizing in relationships and how this lays a foundation of being safe and secure and trustworthy people. So our third of 5 parts we're going to jump right into is forgive always. Now, this is specific to parenting, because we have to have forgiveness for our kids no matter how crappy they are. But it applies to every single relationship because Jesus tells us to forgive. Now, it doesn't mean we forget everything. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences for actions, but in all of our relationships, there's no shortage of opportunities to forgive people. People hurt us on purpose or unintentionally, even if they don't even know they've done it. Kids definitely hurt our feelings. They can be so crappy sometimes. And sometimes they know exactly what buttons to push, and they do, just to hurt our feelings. And the thing is like, if we don't forgive, we build grudges. That builds walls. And holding grudges kills relationships.
Well, and I think that it's super important to, before we go into forgiveness any further, I think it's so important to remember that forgiveness isn't necessarily about them deserving it. It's not it's about us, to be honest, with you more than anything, because just kind of like apologizing brings so much freedom. Forgiving also brings so much freedom. And and so, because I know that we can get hung up on, but they don't deserve. They were so awful. They haven't apologized. They don't even know. They don't even seem to care or know what they did. Those are all things that can go through our mind. And Rachel and I are going to say that everything we have read biblically, that doesn't matter. That the forgiveness needs to happen.
Yep. Well, Jesus leads the way in forgiving. I mean, he forgives us no matter how crappy we are, no matter how many times we sin over and over again. And Ephesians 4:32 says, be kind to one another and tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Like, we are told to forgive one another. And so we have to forgive. In fact, one of my adult children, one time there was like this little survey, and it was like, oh, what does mom like the most and whatever. And I was like wondering how much my kids knew me. And one of the things was like, what's one of the things your mom's really good at? And this son said to me, my mom is really good at forgiving. And I was like, wow, that's huge. And this child has needed a lot of forgiveness. He's hurt me. Like, he doesn't want to hurt me, but he has said really hurtful things in the past. And that's what he said. I'm so good at forgiving. And that has not come naturally. That has not come from me. In my flesh, when someone really hurts me, I just want to withhold forgiveness.
Yeah.
And that has been submitting to God and asking him to humble my heart so that I can forgive. Wouldn't you agree that you probably forgive much more naturally in your flesh than I do, but sometimes it's just literally only an act of God that we can forgive.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I have a much easier time forgiving people who hurt me than I do people who hurt people I love. Like, so I'm going to
that makes sense.
Struggle with it more if they
that
hurt
makes
my
sense.
kids or my husband or you or whatever. And so,
yeah, actually, that does make sense. But what's interesting is I feel like I'm the opposite, not when it comes to my kids, but when it comes to like you or mom or Joey. I think because I'm outside of the picture, I can see the good that God can do in it, even when someone has hurt someone I love. Whereas in my own life, it gets like buried in and bitterness comes out. And so it's much harder for me to see a way to forgiveness. That's interesting because it sounds very selfish and I feel selfish saying it, but I have so much hope when I'm outside the situation looking
Mhm.
in, I'm like, I got all the hope in the world for how God's going to redeem this and how he's going to use it. But for myself, it really eats at me. And
Yeah.
so it's interesting. I'm not
Yeah.
surprised we're opposite in that way
No.
because we're opposite in a lot of ways, but we've never really talked about that. And I've never really
Yeah.
thought about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, now I feel quite selfish.
Oh, I don't think I think it's just a different way of approaching something. I don't think one is
Yeah.
right and one is
I guess that
wrong at
makes sense.
all. I
Well,
mean,
that's
what it
good.
comes down to is we both work on the forgiveness. So
True.
whatever is more
True.
natural for us doesn't
Yep.
matter. It's that
That's
we
true.
push through to the forgiveness. And so
That's true.
just
Yeah.
because it's easier to do one versus the other for one of us and the other's the opposite, I don't think there's
Mhm.
any, it's just a difference. It's not a
Yeah.
good or bad.
Well, that makes me feel better. Thank you. Our next point is love deeply. 1 Peter 4:8 said, above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. And there are times in our relationships when people are difficult to love. Might be a spouse or a child or a boss or a parent, but it happens. It happens. And what I have found is when I tell myself the same negative story over and over and over about how they hurt me, it just breeds negativity.
Mm-hmm.
But if I ask God and I'm reminded to ask God to flip the script and show me how he sees that person, how he loves that person, love and hope can shine through. And so when we love people deeply, it's not a mushy ushy feeling. It's a choice that we make to go to God versus sinking into ourselves and just letting bitterness fester. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. I think that love can be a confusing word
Yeah, I agree.
because we say the word love and we feel like it's romantic or it is
Mhm.
intense feelings or there's
Mhm.
maybe passion involved even if it's not romantic
Mhm.
and I mean the Bible has so many translations of love
Mhm.
and there's brotherly love and there's like a committed love and there is a romantic love and there's all sorts of different kinds of love and so I think that when we talk about loving deeply it's really about I think when I hear that, it's about being willing to see the best in someone, even when
Mhm.
they feel unlovable, even when it feels like
Yes.
they're not, it's
Yes.
hard to see the best in them, but I have to believe that there's good in them
Mhm.
because God made them.
Mhm.
and,
Yep.
and maybe the reason they walk around looking like they hate the world because they've been beaten up in life. Maybe nobody's
Mhm.
ever really given them a chance to feel loved. Like who
Mhm.
knows what their backstory is, or maybe you
Mhm.
do know their backstory. And if you do, well, then they deserve to be seen the best in them even more because
Yeah.
that there's been whatever. I mean, there's just
Yep.
obviously we all have hurt, we all have a past,
Right.
and some people have had the support and love of others to help them heal through it.
Mhm.
Some people are just their personality is designed different where they're going to fight to be healthy. One of my best
Mhm.
friends, she has one of the worst pasts I could ever imagine. And she, on her own, before she even knew
Mhm.
God, just was built to fight for being a better
Yeah.
version of herself. But not everybody's built like that. Some people,
Right.
they have to fight to not sink into bitterness, into anger,
Right.
and so,
Mhm.
um, so yeah, when we talk about love deeply, it's not even about feelings. Like you
Nope.
said, it's a
It's
choice.
choice.
And
Yeah.
mhm,
Well, so the verse in Ephesians says love covers a multitude of sin. So in Proverbs, there's another verse that says hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses, right? They sound so similar. So I was like, kind of like, well, what exactly are these verses talking about? And I found this quote from John Piper that says strife. So it says hatred stirs up strife. Love covers offenses. Strife is when you try to uncover as many offenses as you can. You're on the lookout for people's flaws and failures and imperfections.
mm,
You draw attention to them and you stir up conflict by pointing out the flaws, as many as you can. That's what hate does, according to Proverbs. The opposite would be you're not eager to draw attention to people's flaws or failures. You're not eager to create corporate blame and conflict. Instead, love seeks to deal with flaws and failures and sins another way, more quietly.
mm,
And that is such a choice to say, because I love this human being that God created in his image, I am going to choose to handle it different than maybe even my flesh is rearing and telling me to do.
yep,
And that is to me loving deeply,
yeah,
which is exactly what you said.
mhm.
Oh, and I will say, like, when I have nitpicked my children or like our husbands, right? Like when we do this and we just nitpick, we're not covering our relationships in love. Now, I'm not saying they don't have things we have to call out. And I'm not saying there are not things we need to point out, but it has to be a balance of pointing out the good and the positives and the hope and the future hopes, even. I mean, especially with our kids, sometimes they're just not great in a moment,
Mhm.
like for a season. But you can be like, but I raised you, and Proverbs says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not part from it, which says, I've put in the work. I can trust eventually we're going to see the fruits of this,
Yeah.
even if we don't see it right now. And so we can even speak into the future hope of the child. Like, I believe you're going to be a man of honor and a
Mhm.
woman of integrity.
Mhm.
Am I seeing that right now? Nope, I am not. And even with our spouses, I mean, like, obviously it's a little more condescending to speak like that, but like, I believe the best in you.
Mhm.
What God is doing in you, even if you're not showing me the best right now, right? And some of those words could be kept inside, but like
Mhm.
the idea of acknowledging inside they're not their best version, but like I also trust and believe the best is there. In fact, I'll never forget that one time I had a friend, I shared with her a deep wound had happened. And it killed me. It was something to do with how someone had hurt my kid. And I was so enraged. And I said to this friend that I thought was so safe to me, I hate this person.
Mhm.
And I knew it was not okay to hate. I knew I was sinning in the feeling and in the saying, but I felt safe enough to tell this person how ugly I felt.
Mhm.
And it didn't go well. This person did not handle it well at all. And I said, Melissa, I understand. I can say this to you. And I thought, I could to this person. And she said, yeah, if you had said that to me, I wouldn't question for a moment where you're going to land. Because I know you're the kind of person that's going to seek Jesus. You're going to be convicted. You're going to confess. You're going to ask for forgiveness. And you're going to move forward.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean we don't have ugly feelings in the now.
Well, yeah,
And
the roadway to the healthy spot isn't, I mean, we're human. So the road
right.
that we walk to get to the place of healthiness isn't usually beautiful or even well
No,
done.
No. And so even with ourselves, right? Like I need people who see the best in me, even when I'm crumbling at the
Yeah.
moment. And so it's so
Mhm.
important that we recognize if we need this,
Mhm.
if we have children, like they need it, but our
Yeah.
husbands need it too. Like our best friends need it. People need that grace for us to be like, I know you're going to get there. You're on this path. You're choosing,
Mhm.
especially if somebody loves Jesus is really, I guess what I'm
Mhm.
pointing to, like, and just believing the best in each other. And
Yeah.
that is loving deeply.
Well, and I do, yeah. And I think, I mean, going back to your situation, when we go through something so painful, like grief is real and grief can show up in all sorts of different ways. And hating someone for a small period of time while you're working your way
Mhm.
through the grief,
Mhm.
I think that's super normal and human. And like you
Mhm.
said, you're not going to stay there. You don't have any interest in, I mean, you're not there anymore, but at the time
No,
you had no interest in hating someone forever. But in
no,
that
no, that's
moment,
horrible. That hurts
yeah,
me inside.
right, exactly. And that is, yeah, where it's, giving people the benefit of the doubt is part of
Mhm.
loving well,
Right,
assuming, like
right.
you said, assuming the best in them. And yeah.
Mhm. Well, and in that
That's
moment,
so true.
if this person had been very disappointed in me, right, but just let me
Mhm.
talk, and I asked this person to pray for me, right, prayed over my heart, and maybe a week or two later been like, I have some concerns, and I would be like, I'm not there. I shouldn't have been there. I'm not there anymore,
Mhm.
right? That isn't what happened.
Mhm.
But that is how we can handle those situations is like, hey, I was a little concerned about something you said last week. Can we talk
Mhm.
about that? Right. But maybe
Yeah.
not in the moment when someone
Yeah.
is like knee deep in flesh and devastation and hurt
Mhm.
and raw anger. And yeah.
Yeah,
So,
nobody needs
anyways,
a lecture when they're in that kind of pain, when they're
right.
hurting like that. Yeah. We
But
just
that's
need
good
to
to
be
remember about our families because I
yeah.
think sometimes it is easy to jump to the lecture.
Absolutely. 100%. Well, and either the lecture or the fixing. Like, when our
Mhm.
kids are really one of my boys, he's kind of lonely right now. He's made some choices to step away from a friend group that
Mhm.
he's not liking where that friend group is going. And so
Mhm.
so he's just kind of everybody likes him, but he feels a little invisible right now, which and when he has nights where he's just crying and he just wants to talk to me, and if I half almost every time I try talking to him, he's like, can you just not talk, like, can you just let
Mhm.
me? And I'm like, yep, you're right, because he's not going to stay in this heaviness, but he's
Mhm.
just his feelings are real, they're
Mhm.
valid and understandable, and some nights are just worse than other nights. And
Right.
and
Mhm.
I can't fix the situation, and I
Right.
just have to let him. I mean, we went through our own times at that, in high
Mhm.
school where it was very
Mhm.
lonely and things were hard, and nobody could
Mhm.
change it. We just had to move through time, and
Right. Mhm.
so even if we're not trying to lecture, we often are trying to fix, and that is
Right.
something
It's
I
true.
regularly am having to remind myself of. Like,
Mhm.
they just have to hurt right now, and that's hard.
Right. Mhm. Well, it's interesting because I just had something that I was really feeling deeply over one of my kids, and I haven't had probably the feelings I should have had, like delayed feelings, if you will. And I brought those feelings to my best friend and my sister separately. And my best friend is amazing, and she jumped right in and was so encouraging and so helpful. And my sister said, I hear your feelings. My heart aches for you. Do you want to hear anything from me, or do you just want me to sit here? My friend came back and said, I feel like I shouldn't have just jumped in. I just was encouraging you because I just want you not to hurt, but I didn't feel like I sat with you in your feelings. And she said that
Mm,
all on her own. And I was like, yeah, no, she didn't. And I wasn't upset. She didn't do anything wrong. She was
yeah.
super encouraging. She probably said exactly the same kind of things you would have said, but I wasn't
Mhm.
in a place to hear it. And so I
Right.
just needed someone to sit with me.
Yeah.
And then, a couple days of just really real raw hurt feelings. I was able to start talking about it. I went to therapy, and it's
Mhm.
like, it, there is something really beautiful about just sitting with people in their feelings and letting them know I'm here if and when you want to talk about it. But I think that's something that we need to do more of,
Agreed.
myself included, in every relationship, is offer our, I'm just going to sit here with you.
Mhm. Well, what's funny is in that situation that you're talking about, my first reaction, I typed out a whole bunch of things,
I'm sure
and
you
then
did.
and then I deleted them all because I'm like, "She doesn't want this right now." Like, I know
Yeah.
you enough to know
Uh-huh.
that what you were saying, you just were hurting, and you just needed to be hurting,
Processing
and
and yeah.
yeah, and, because what happens, how I feel, maybe not everybody feels this way, but when I am hurting or struggling, really mad, really whatever my big feelings are, and I'm sharing them with you, first of all, what a privilege to be
Right.
being shared with, right? If someone
Mm-hmm.
ever
Yep.
is sharing the depths of their heart with you, it is a
Mm-hmm.
huge privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And
And it says that they think you're safe.
exactly. And then, but if that person then comes and just starts talking me down or talking at me, I often feel invalidated, or like now I have to defend my
Why you
feelings,
feel the
or
way you feel.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
or defend like, yeah, I'm not going to stay here, but I am here right now. Like, whereas if people just let you be and
Mm-hmm.
say, I feel it with you, or I can imagine, or I
Mm-hmm.
see it, like whatever, I'll hug you, I'm praying for you, like what, just kind of keeping it simple. Um, there's so much, you feel so heard in that
Mm-hmm.
space, even
Mm-hmm.
though so
Yep.
little is said. Isn't that interesting?
Right. It's so true. Well, what's funny is when my friend said to me, I feel like I didn't sit with you. I should have sat with you and just felt your feelings with you. And I remember thinking, I need to get better at that. Like,
Hmm.
I feel like I'm quick to just give encouragement, right?
Hmm.
Which it's good to encourage people, but
Right.
there's a time and a place. And immediately, I didn't say those words out loud. She goes, You're so good at that, just sitting with people and their feelings. And I was like, I am. I was just thinking, I need to be better, which just because she said it doesn't mean I don't need to do better. But it was so funny because I was immediately convicted, like, I need to do
That's
better at
funny.
this. And
Hmm.
yeah. So
That's really
loving
funny.
deeply, not talking about feelings at all. All these
Yeah.
things are choices, right?
Mhm.
But they matter.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
our
Well, and it can
last
change.
point. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, when somebody takes the time to intentionally love you deeply, it can
Mhm.
change our life. Like,
It
I mean,
can.
I
Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. It sounds dramatic to say, but it is not. It's true.
It's not.
And
Mhm.
we both have experienced that, which is why
Mhm.
we know how life changing it can be.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, so our last point is hope for the best, but expect failures. So, of course, this is with our kids, but this is all relationships, right? Like nobody gets married and never fights.
Mhm.
Nobody gets married and knows how to do it all. Nobody has a job and doesn't make any mistakes. Nobody has children who are perfect out the gate. And I just kept thinking, when I was thinking about this point, I just kept thinking when a baby learns to walk, they immediately fall.
Mhm.
I've never heard of a baby who just started walking and never fell again. They immediately fall. And what do? We just cheer and applaud. And we're
Mhm.
so happy that they took 2 steps
Right.
and then fell. They literally fail right
Yeah.
away. They start failing. But the failure is part of the process,
Mhm.
it's part of them figuring it out. And I heard this thing recently that said, when your kids go out in the world and everyone's like, oh, your kids are so great and so respectful, right? That's amazing. And then you think, why are they so crazy and crappy in my house?
Mhm.
It's because the home is the lab and they're learning in the lab. But then the real world is the real world. And that's how
Yeah.
you know what you're doing in the lab is working,
Yeah.
because they're making all their mistakes at home right in front of you where it's safe in the lab. And then they go out in the world, and that's a true testament of who you have helped raise them to be.
Yeah.
And while I don't really want to live in the lab very much anymore,
Which lab?
I'll take a little bit more of what's happening in the world. That was very helpful for me to remember they're failing at home, but getting it so much right in the world.
Yeah.
Not that our kids are getting everything perfect in the world, but
Right.
like, you know, when we're really struggling with someone at home, or even our husbands, if we're just like, man, sometimes you can just be so crappy to me, but like, you're so good to everyone else. Now, this is different than our kids, but it's like, okay, I know that he is an amazing man because I see how he loves other people. We just have some things to figure out here, but then like believing for that best, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think Bridget is our sister-in-law, is definitely the one who reminded me when my kids were really little that the days she expects her kids to get it right are the worst parenting days.
Absolutely.
And the days she expects they're going to make mistakes, I'm going to make mistakes, and we're going to learn from it, were the days filled with the best. Yeah.
Well, so Rachel used to live in Chicago and I live in Minnesota. So it was like an 8-hour drive to go see her. And I would go see her many, many times a year with all of my kids. And people would often be like, how do you do an 8-hour car trip alone with your kids? And I was like, well, I expect it to take a long time. And I expect
to be clear, it was a 6-hour trip that always turned into 8 because she had such little kids.
It took me 8 hours. And, and I was like, I expect to stop every 2 hours. And when we get out, I have them run around. Like we would go to the parking lot, or, you know, like the grassy part of a parking lot and of a gas station. And I would have them do relays or play tag a little bit and get their energy out. I would expect them to fight. I would expect them to get hungry. I would expect them not to want the snacks that I packed. And it rarely was a bad trip. Even though all those things happened, because I had learned a long time ago, if I would like go to the grocery store and expect perfection, I hated them throughout the whole entire grocery store. And it was like 1 hour because
worst parenting day.
I needed them to be perfect. And of course they weren't. So then I was mad at them. Whereas when I started being like, okay, well, you're not going to be perfect, but I'm going to expect that you're going to do this and this and that. But also I do expect you to listen. Like, you know, I mean, it's not that I didn't expect them to listen. It's just that
you still had high standards.
I had high standards, but I wasn't setting myself up to fail.
Right.
By having it not go perfect because I was with 5 little kids. Like, and I have given that piece of advice just for car trips to moms so many times. Don't expect it to be perfect, and you're not going to be so upset because when you get there, you're like, oh, that went exactly as I planned. I assumed that somebody would cry. I assumed that somebody would get antsy. I would assume that someone was going to fight, and they did, and it wasn't a big deal, and you move through it. And so that's such a small, you know,
expectations change everything.
They do. Yeah. And it's setting ourselves. Yeah. So if we are assuming our kids to get it right all the time, we're going to be so disappointed in them.
We're let down constantly. And then our kids feel that. No. And they feel that. Yeah. And so it's a huge part of, I think, relationships and parenting is like expecting everything's not going to go perfectly. And then when it doesn't go perfectly, okay, I'm prepared for this. Now what am I going to do? Exactly. So those are the 5 points that we wanted to talk about with parenting and just relationships. But the last thing I want to share before we are done with this episode is specifically when it comes to parenting, but even just difficult relationships in general, difficult, hard relationships, is that sometimes it feels like, why is this so much work? Like, would somebody do a better job at this? Like, you know, but God knew who he had in mind for each of your kids in their parenting. He knew who he had in mind with you, your spouse. He knew who your parents were going to be, who your sister was going to be. He knows all of this. And he knows that we are the right person for the job in our parenting and in our marriages. Like, he knows that so he didn't make a mistake in who we are. So if we ever feel like, someone else would do a better job, I just really want to encourage you. God knows what he's doing and how this was going to go and all the mistakes you're going to make and all the mistakes they're going to make and the learning lab. He knows it all. And he is in it with you.
Well, and he doesn't expect perfection from us.
No.
I mean,
No.
that is, I think maybe the first place we need to start with being okay with it not being
Right.
perfect is ourselves. And,
Right. Mm-hmm.
you know, we can have very, very high expectations of ourselves, and that doesn't usually set us up to do well.
Nope. No, it
High
doesn't.
standards are different than high expectations,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so we can have this. My standard of being a mom is I want to love my kids so well. I want to be full of grace and humility. I want to
Mhm.
teach them about Jesus. I want to laugh with them. I want to make them feel comfortable and safe and welcome with anything they ever have to tell us.
Mhm.
I am never going to get that all right. I am going to
Right.
fail in that. So my standard is that, but I'm never going to get it perfect, and I know that.
Your
And so
expectation is that it's not ever going to be fully achieved on earth.
exactly, I can always be striving for that and be working on that and asking Jesus to make me more like him, but I will never be fully like him, and I will never get
Right.
it perfect on earth, and that is
Right.
okay.
Well, and the same thing goes for our kids and even like our spouses, right? Like we can have high standards for them. Like, hey, I expect you to complete all your homework. I expect you to speak to me with respect and other adults with respect. I expect you to listen the first time. Those are my standards.
Yeah.
The expectation is they're going to fail a lot while they're learning how to do that.
Right.
And I had this story that I remember when Brighton was like 9 months old, he still had to sleep swaddled. He never even had one arm out. It was fully swaddled. He was the easiest baby for me, but he would not sleep without being swaddled. And his pediatrician was like, well, he's not going to go to college in a swaddle. And it was basically like, it's fine. He'll be done with the swaddle when he's done with the swaddle. He's not going to go to college doing that. And I use that in my own brain a lot. Like, man, this kid, but then it's like, he's not going to go to college doing all these things. He does at 4 or 7 or 11. Like, it's all a process. And the things that they go to college still doing, they're not necessarily going to do at 25 and 30 and 40, right? And I remember, so I'm the third. So Melissa, and then we have a brother, and then me, and then younger brother. And all three of us were walking with Jesus, like, you know, very solid, Bible-loving, Bible-following, Jesus-loving people. And our brother, who's like 3 years younger than me, was just he wasn't not following Jesus. He just wasn't very mature in his faith. Well, I was like 24 at the time, right? 23, something like that. So he was like 20, and Melissa's 5 years older than me, and the brother in between us, whatever. And I remember just being so irritated, like when is he gonna get it? And Melissa was like, don't you think that we could have felt the same way about you? What? She was like,
when you were 20?
Yeah. She's like, you didn't come out of the womb like doing all these things. Like, it's like, it's the same kind of equation to me as like the story about he's not going to go to college doing that. It's like, he's not going to be here forever. Whatever crappy thing they're in, they're not going to be there forever. Especially if we have taught our children how to go to God and follow Jesus, like, then they're going to be on this constant path of desiring to be like him and learn more. And we just have to be along for the ride.
Trust the process.
And trust the process. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So anything else?
Good stuff. No.
I don't even have one challenge. I'm like, just take something from each section.
Yeah. Tell us, my challenge to you is tell us what spoke to you the most.
I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
Or respond in comments, whatever. We would love to know.
Yeah. Yeah, we would. So,
all right.
All right. Thank you guys. Have a great week. All right. Bye.
You might feel that your life is a mess, but don't feel bad. Ours is too, but we own a microphone and we have no shame. That's why we'll talk about how our life is a mess nonetheless. That's the name of our podcast.